I was doing a PhD focused on North Korea, and at the low point of that experience, I happened to be introduced to a young Singaporean chap called Jeffrey C, and he was just starting to put together a program to teach North Koreans business and economic policy. And at that point, I was more interested in finding ways to work with North Koreans rather than just write about them from a distance. So I jumped at the chance to help him get this thing going, and that was 2010. A couple of years later, we managed to get enough support that the two of us came on full time, and I moved to Beijing, and we began running a lot of programs, bringing North Koreans to Singapore for study trips of 2 weeks up to 3 months, and going to North Korea several times a year to run programs there. Working in North Korea has a unique set of challenges, as you might imagine. The control they place over you as a visitor is really unparalleled in the modern world. So everything you do has to be vetted, everything has to be prepared well in advance, and while you're there, you're not really free to roam about and do what you like. Then externally, there's been mounting pressure as well. Obviously, since 2006, the first nuclear test that North Korea conducted, there's been increasing rounds of sanctions in reaction to their ongoing missile and nuclear program, and that's made things more difficult as well. Working on a type of project that had never really been done before was obviously exhilarating, and for me personally to meet a lot of North Koreans and learn how they think and how their economy is run and sort of the daily challenges that an ordinary Pyongyanger faces has been illuminating as well. So I've written a book comparing Myanmar and North Korea. I did this because I'd been working in North Korea for several years, and to be honest, I was getting a little burnt out. My wife got a job opportunity in Myanmar, and she was like, should I do this? Is crazy, right? And I was like, no, let's do this. I will have a chance. It was 2014. I will have a chance to see what a country has to go through when it is re-emerging from a long period of isolation. And I thought maybe there might be lessons to learn for North Korea there. And for me, the comparison between the two countries is kind of intuitive. It's a question, and a reasonable question, that I get quite a lot. These are very different countries. Is comparing them valid? I think it is, because when you look at the region, these are the only two post-Cold War pariahs that have been sanctioned, that have relied on the military as the primary organizing institution, and really as the cultural force in the country. And what I argue in the book is that both of these countries faced existential security threats within a few years of independence. For both, that came very quickly after the end of the Second World War and the collapse of the Japanese Empire. For Myanmar, the turning point really came in the 1990s, when a number of insurgencies that had been raging for decades were basically finally put to bed, either through victory or through negotiation. And once their state was secure, they were able to turn to deal with democratization and the reasons that they were a pariah. North Korea, their existential threat has been South Korea and a superpower, the United States, that's been on their doorstep again since the 1950s. And their response to that problem has been the nuclear program. And what that's done is it's driven them further into isolation. So they haven't yet found their way out of this position that their core security threat has placed them in. Now, of course, we're at a very interesting moment where more than ever before, we're seeing Pyongyang make a really concerted effort to resolve the reasons for its isolation. We don't know where this process will end up, but they're clearly trying to address that core security threat, but also the policies that have isolated them for the past several decades. Being the Koret Fellow has been amazing, and I'm not just this is what I tell people when there's not a camera trained on me. The quality of people here at Stanford and the kinds of people who visit and come through are obviously top-notch, and there's a lot of opportunity for collaboration, probably even more than I expected. So while I'm here, it's clear that I'm able to reach out to various people and see if we have interests in common that could lead to projects. So I'm working on an article about the alliance with a co-author, and looking at a project that will maybe help us understand the construction industry in North Korea a little bit better. The main thing I'm working on while I'm here as the Koret Fellow is a book, which will be a general reader about North Korea. It will be filled with anecdotes, I think many of which should be quite amusing and others hopefully poignant, that illustrate some of the difficulties and vagaries of being North Korean as well as being a foreigner working in North Korea. And hopefully through those kinds of stories, I'll be able to let readers see the outlines of North Korea's international relations, its economy, the social changes that have taken place in the last decade or so, that kind of thing. It's difficult exactly to know how the negotiations have been conducted between the U.S. and North Korea. North Korea, of course, is incredibly opaque, and then the Trump administration has also done a very good job of keeping things in-house. For a government that's been so leaky on this issue, they've kept things very tight. So it's not clear exactly why, but at the end of 2018, the North Koreans put out a story on their newswire that really spelled out that denuclearization was not going to be a unilateral process. They're not just going to denuclearize and then see what they get for it. This is something that they've said before, but I think it was interesting that they did it just before Christmas at a time when the contours of a second summit are coming into view, at least for the Trump administration and for Pyongyang. But also the timing of it allows them really to enter the new year having clearly communicated to the Americans what they expect. And then the Americans will have to choose whether or not to proceed on those terms. And I think it seems as if Trump has decided he's willing to proceed on those terms. There is kind of a maximalist view of denuclearization in Washington, D.C., which sees the North Koreans give up all their missile facilities, all their nuclear production facilities, and very invasive monitoring, that kind of thing, the, I guess, Boltonian view. But increasingly, I'm hearing voices that are much more willing to compromise. A recognition, essentially, that it's basically too late to get to the kind of denuclearization that we might have hoped for 13 years ago, 14 years ago. Fundamentally, the solution to the problem on the Korean Peninsula is going to be a political one. It's going to be about changing the political and social relationship between North Korea and the outside world, particularly the US and South Korea. And that's just going to be such a huge challenge that I really hope we get a lot of momentum in the coming year or two that makes it more difficult to walk back on for all parties, because not only will it be difficult for the North Koreans, they really have, their whole society is in some ways built on the premise that the world is a hostile place, and the DPRK has to be a garrison to protect against that world, and changing that narrative is going to be quite hard. On our side, on the US side, Washington has proved to be a pretty unreliable partner when it comes to making deals with adversaries. We see it most recently with Iran, but we've seen it before with North Korea. It's hard to sustain something that's really difficult over a long period of time because of the nature of politics in Washington, which I think, as we all know, have become more volatile and less certain than ever. So I really hope in the coming weeks and months a lot of progress is made so that it's more difficult to step away from.